Good evening. I'm Ralph Rosenberg, and welcome to this event. I really appreciate everyone coming here tonight. I said the program would start at 6:30 sharp, and it will. In a few minutes, Curt Meine will begin talking, and he's going to end up talking for about 20, 25 minutes. And afterwards, there will be question and answer. I wanted to know, I'm going to give a little bit of talk about tonight's events, the hosts, sponsoring. I'm going to have his daughter Annika do a little book reading, and then we'll go to Curt. But tonight's event is part of a multi-city book launch, and it's primarily organized by the Johnson Center for Land Stewardship Policy. That's why you're going to see this all over the place. And it's Please Take One. We also have other things in addition to the books that are trying to be sold, which proceeds help the Johnson Center. This collection of essays, which was put together by Charlie, I think Charlie's still here, Bruner, is just available for your option for your taking. That's right. There's several people here from who are members of the Johnson Center, who are like board members or active, and Charlie's here. I'm trying to think who else. And Annika Johnson, his daughter's here. Curt Meine's here. Mark Rasmussen is here. Okay, and tell you that the Johnson Center for Land Stewardship was formed. I know, there you go. Was formed right shortly after Paul's passing, and its goals are to organize events. We've had previous events at the Harkin Center in Des Moines to support this book. Many of us helped with the support of the Johnson Center, which helped Curt produce this book. And then also we do have raised funds for Emerging Leader Awards, and we're really lucky because we have the most recent recipient of the Emerging Leaders Award. At least she was here 15 minutes ago. Margaret, thank you very much. The one person, one of the few people without any gray hair. That's like I said. And if you have any questions, by the way, the website's very easy to remember. It's landcommunity.org. I do want to mention the sponsors, which is Ames Library is wonderful to work with. Then Dog-Eared Books is back. It has a table there as well. And the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Center is also a sponsor of it. I see at least one elected official here. I think Beth is here at least. Beth, is anyone an elected official besides Beth Russell-Quishell? That's okay. Beth's the only one who counts, so it's... So I'm going to introduce Curt and then have ask Annika to do a little reading. So this book really tells it all about we can do it better. The book's focus is on land conservation and public policy, but when you get into the book, you'll find out that Paul was also a leader on other stuff. So don't be surprised when you're going to read Paul's writings about the lack of access in rural Iowa to OBGYN care. Don't be surprised when you can see about Paul's leadership on Iowa's one of the leading states back in the 80s on reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Paul promoted campaign reform, needed probably more than ever. With that, I think I'd like to have Annika just, before I introduce Curt formally, just to have Annika come up. Annika's been working with the center and Annika Johnson.
Thank you, Ralph. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's always exciting to look out and see people who knew him and know my mom, because we talk a lot about my dad, but my mom still is very much alive and would have come to this event if she hadn't replaced her right hip a week ago. So if a can graciously to do that at 86, this is her second out of 4 that she will replace, right? Knees and hips, so that she can continue to travel. I just want to take a few minutes to read. Curt may do more of it as he talks a little bit, but I am struck by a lot of things as I read this book. It's a privilege to see it come out. And it reminds me of all the things that my dad, Paul, to all of you, but my dad was. He would write on his campaign brochure, farmer, father, former state legislator, public servant. But what gets me of all the other things that he was, which was a very curious historian, a lifelong listener, a lover of being up at the cabin and seeing the dark and hearing the silence. So this is from a main celebration of nature, 1988, towards the end of his 6 years in the legislature. It's a clear, crisp, windy morning in the North Woods. The water in the wash basin on the porch is stiff, and even though I'm inside, I have to position my chair on the downwind side of the wood stove to keep warm. I left Iowa a week ago. Spring was upon us. In the late afternoon sun, our newly seeded oats were beginning to cast a green tinge on the otherwise bare ground, and the winter's stockpile of manure was spread. I'm not eating corn this year. Our cribs are still full, and the world market doesn't seem to need any more. But my neighbor's cows do, and so he was there planting, and I'm here giving my mind a rest after 4 months of wearing dress shoes and a necktie. To this farmer legislator, the shoes don't feel right, and the tie is more like a noose than a necklace. It must be the same for me who want to be in simple and wild things. As I left Iowa and crossed the Minnesota border, my heart was heavy. The railroad that paralleled US 52 a few years ago is gone. Its steel rails have been sold for scrap, and its oak ties are used for landscape timbers in suburban backyards. The bed is leveled, and for the 8th year, corn pheasants and meadowlarks once made their nests. He goes on in this essay to talk about how it gets a little bit darker and he gets a little bit tired as he goes north. And then he spends a week up in the Boundary Waters at the cabin. And at the end of the essay, he writes, "Our oldest son graduates from college next week, and he'll have the world at his fingertips. Tears come to my eyes as I recall a night 8 years ago when it was getting late and Eric had not come in from the barn. He was only 13, still working when I recovered from back surgery. I shuffled out to see what was wrong. I arrived to find all the cows milked, fed, and bedded down happily chewing cuds. Eric was sitting on the straw, his back against his favorite cow, and 2 kittens were playing in his lap. The radio was turned to KU, where progressive rock was airing. Except for the music, mine was Woody Guthrie, he was experiencing what I had 25 years earlier. Our life in Iowa has been good. Neighbors have been friendly and simply did more. We've slowly worked at our dreams and can now walk under the pine that we and the children planted and soon fill with new hay, the post and beam barn that we and our neighbors raised a couple of years ago. Our children are healthy and have respect for land, for life. Oh, and dreams to fulfill. We still haven't rebuilt the old window, which we still haven't done, or torn down the dilapidated hog house, which we have. As we shift from milk cows to sheep, it seems as if we have miles of fence to replace, and our house, although it was started in 1853, still longs to be finished. But we live in peace, and even though we can still appreciate things wild and free. Hardly a day goes by without seeing wild turkey or deer, and you can always look up to see a hawk or sometimes an eagle soaring overhead. For our daughter, Annika, wild things include and a possum now and then in the chicken house. There are signs everywhere in us, what Aldo Leopold called the land aesthetic. We hear whippoorwills, owls, and woodcock at night, and a host of songbirds from well before sunup until the evening stars appear. The wilderness this week has brought me full circle. I left Iowa feeling low. My days in the North Country have cleared my mind, and Iowa is once again where I want to be. As I leave, I think of Leopold when he said that there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. Like Leopold, I cannot, but I also need my family and our Iowa farm. I'm ready to go home. So with that, I'll turn it over to Curt Meine.
Thanks. Thanks. Speaking of Leopold, there are former employees of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture here, and Mark Rasmussen is here, and I saw Jerry and Laura and Alan. There may be some other former employees of the Leopold Center that I just don't know or recognize. So if you want to stand and be recognized, it was one of our proudest moments. I had the honor of serving with Paul and doing this. So did Charlie Bruner, and it was one of Paul's proudest creations. So I want to thank you all for implementing it and putting it into force. Thank you. Oh, thank you. And Adam, you're a current employee. Sorry, Adam. Adam's in the back. I didn't recognize you without your gray. I was only doing people with gray hair, Adam. Okay. Curt Meine. Curt's written a number of other books. Annika has a collection of all his books back there. I want to just give you one sample. Curt wrote the definitive biography of Aldo Leopold. This is the library's copy I'm holding. Curt was a friend and fellow professional of Paul for 40-some years. In my view, Paul stood for sustainable agriculture and resources. This book that Curt's going to talk about, this book and Paul's vision will be sustainable to the work that's expressed in this book. So again, thank you for coming. Curt Meine.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Annika. I'm glad that a little of two minds, though. She read a bit from the book so that I don't have to feel pressure to do that right away. But then again, following Annika reading her father's words, can we just stop and go home now? Because I don't know quite how to follow that. So Megan, thank you for all of your help in organizing, and everyone else at the library and the bookstore and everyone else, and Ralph, and it's really been wonderful. This book really is a community effort, and I've said to Annika this morning over coffee, Paul represented a community of people, both as an elected official, but also as a public figure in a larger world of agriculture, conservation, and other public issues. But that community also created Paul. He drew upon this community in Iowa to become who he was. And I'm going to try to give you a little bit of his story. But first, let me do a couple things to orient me. How many people in this room knew Paul? All right. For those, I think if we're on Zoom here, about half the people in the room knew Paul, and others, I can see the younger folks in the back of the room who are way too young to have known Paul during his prime, but that helps me to figure out where I'm going here. I'm also very mindful. I'm from Wisconsin. I came over from near Spring Green, where I live, the other side of the Driftless area. And yet I feel like I've been living in Iowa in my head for the last several months because Iowa is in the news a lot. And people in this room particularly are tuned to the reasons that Iowa's been in the news. Whether it's the New York Times just a few days ago, and the Washington Post, of several other national publications, the issues of groundwater. Issues of surface water quality, cancer rates, public health, water, if you're in Des Moines particularly, treating your water, et cetera, et cetera. These are all issues that are swirling, not only here in Iowa, but beyond. And I'm reading about them all the time and trying to figure out how can I come and share some things that might be helpful. So I'm mindful of that, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how the book came about and what I tried or my colleagues tried to do with it. And then I'm going to show some slides. This is a little more than a book event, but a little less than a lecture. So I'll try to do a little bit of context for understanding Paul and his life and work that helps to inform what's in the book. And then leave some time for Q&A at the end. But before I do that, here are some sighs and nods here. How many of you knew Fred Kirschenman? Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, you probably knew him better than I did. And I only met Fred a few times in my life, but they were so memorable. What a fellow to really embed himself in your way of being and thinking. For those of you who don't know Fred, he was another national leader, global leader in sustainable regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, a farmer, of course, and of course the director of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. He just passed away last month here in Ames. So I'm very cognizant of his spirit being with us here, and please extend to, if you see them, his family, regards from his friends in Wisconsin too. And maybe I'll take the moment, I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, but let's honor Fred a little bit. This is just a random sample from one of the Leopold Center's newsletters. I just wanted to pull something off, and I didn't even really read it, but I'll just read you a little bit from, this is from 2012, of Fred. In the Western world, we seem to be enmeshed in a culture that values things more than relationships. And the same principle seems to hold true in our food and agriculture enterprises. As a consequence, our agriculture and food systems goals have been reduced to some simplistic objectives. Achieving the maximum yield of a few crops in one part of the world is more important than enabling people to feed themselves in their own communities. The problem of feeding 9 billion people in a climate-changing world often is reduced to inventing a few new technologies. Producing more of our commodities with fewer farmers is considered more important than sustaining resilient rural communities where the farmers live. Maximizing profits in the short term is deemed more important than passing on biologically healthy soil to future generations. I could go on. He does take a turn in this little essay toward a more positive role, but and saying what the Leopold Center was about and is about and maybe will be about. So I honor Fred along with all those who knew and appreciated his contributions, which built on and with all that Paul did. It was a generation of leadership, including many others, Wendell Berry, Wes Jackson out in Kansas, so many others working, and many in this room. And I'm very pleased to know that there are several representatives of the practical farmers of Iowa here too. So I just included this cover again, but because I love the photo. And I could give you 20 minutes on how we ended up with this photo. It wasn't the original choice, but we couldn't get the original permission for the original photo. It was published in National Geographic. But the same photographer, Matt Bradley, this photo was taken in 1978. We tracked Matt Bradley down. And he said, well, you know, if you can't get permission from that photo, I took a lot more that day. So, and I love this one. It just captures so much. And the more I look at it, the more I appreciate it. I won't say too much about it because you can get your own impressions, but I love the fact that Paul's got a nice clean white shirt on. He's going off to do, or maybe he just got back from doing something a little more official in town. I don't know. I don't know the story behind it, but that it captures Paul's life as a private person farming with his family on his land, and his public life being out in the world trying to make it a better place. There's a lot more I could say about this photo, but he did love jerseys. This is another photo favorite of mine of Paul because it captures him in a role that he really didn't think of himself in, and that is as a writer. Paul wrote a lot in his public life and more in his personal world too. But he didn't think of himself as a writer, first and foremost. In his later years, he began to think a little more self-consciously about that. I'll talk about that. But here he is, at the home outside Decorah, composing himself with his standard, yellow legal pad. And I've read a lot of the drafts that came off those legal pads. So the book came about actually after 40 years of conversation and friendship and mentorship, really, from him to me. And him sharing with me a lot of his writing in process, especially in the last decade or so of his life. He wrote a lot as a public official in various ways, speeches, reports, letters home to his constituents, letters to the editor, all kinds of different public documents, if you will. But in his last decade, he began to write a little more personally and introspectively, and this captures him in that mood. When he began to think of himself as more of a writer, and he worked very hard. He it was a goal of his to write a book, especially on the theme of conservation on our private lands, on our working landscape. He felt very strongly and said so much in his public life, in his public work, that we have to pay much more attention to private lands as opposed to public national forests, state lands, national parks, where so much of the attention of conservation had been focused for so long, with good reason and with good results. But he felt that relatively private lands have been neglected and it's scattershot, and we piece together policy, farm bill to farm bill to farm bill, and we need to do much more, and we need, quote, to do better. So he wanted to write a book on that theme, and he shared drafts with me, and we talked about it on the phone a lot. And after his near fatal tractor accident, that was another factor. He was not as mobile, so perhaps that also led him to be a little more thoughtful about his own writing. However, he wasn't able to finish that book. As his health issues mounted, it became more and more difficult. And I was very much hoping to come over and spend a day or two with him and kind of help him and prod him and give him some thoughts on how to do that. But then COVID came on. And for the last year or so of his life, we were unable to meet in person. So and I didn't want to come and visit, obviously, to reduce risk for both of us. So it was a frustration, perhaps, but it was also a chance for me to think about how I could come after his passing into this project and help him perhaps achieve the goal of publishing a book that he didn't achieve in his own life. So that's how the book comes about very quickly. It's a collection of everything we could find that Paul had written and published. Roughly the first third of the book is made up of actually letters he wrote back, or reports really, that he published in the local papers in and around Decorah, reports to his constituents while he was serving in the state legislature, telling them what he had been doing. And so it's a real window into that period in Iowa political history, and the role that he played, along with at least several people in the room here. So it's really helpful to read these as a historic record. I partly wear a hat sometimes as a historian and thinking about conservation. And what was accomplished here in Iowa is of national, even international significance. The second third of the book, roughly, are things he wrote while he became a national figure in government and conservation. a lot of them having to do with his period when he was the chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Washington, and very involved. And back of the room there is Max Schnepp, who sat at his side in a lot of the meetings and conversations, and maybe even helped to edit a few of the things that Paul was writing at the time. The last third are these writings from the last part of Paul's life that are, again, a little more introspective and retrospective, and reveal a little bit more of his way of seeing the world and who he was. And that was, so there's several goals if you've been, as I described this, one is to preserve for history's sake the contributions of this key figure. Another is to help illuminate themes that are still in the headlines every single day, and many of us are involved in those. Another is to help people understand who this individual was. To help Paul tell his own story in his own words. I'm not going to read too much from the book. I'll use a couple quotes here. But I want to tell a couple stories in the next 15 minutes or so here. And I'm going to give a little bit of biographical background. But here is, I've talked about this theme of private land conservation. And here's one of the fine expressions of it from this landmark report that came out in 1997 with, again, Max in the back of the room being very key in that process. But this stance he took and that he was a leader in, recognizing that just protecting natural beauty and certain special lands alone can't provide the quality of environment we need and want. We need to recognize the values and needs of America's private land and private landowners for us to have a true geography of hope, a phrase he picked up from the writer Wallace Stegner, whom he read a lot of. So I'm going to just do a very brief bio. This is not a full biography, but I thought it would be fun for those of you, especially who knew Paul, and even those of you didn't, to get a little sense of his the background for a lot of these. He was born in Oakland. He moved around a lot as a young kid and man, all across the upper Midwest from South Dakota to Chicago and in between. So thank you to the family and especially to brother Eric for digging these photos and sharing of them. This photo, why do I show this? Because in a weird way, this is Paul embarking on his public career. This is him as a young student, he's on the right there, as a student at the University of Illinois. And what is he doing on that airport tarmac in Champaign-Urbana? He's meeting, well, in this case, he's just working. But it was while he was he must have been, this is 1962, so he is 21 years old, 20 or 21. Who should come in the summer of 1960 to Champaign-Urbana's airport but John F. Kennedy? Kennedy was on the presidential campaign trail and landed in Champaign-Urbana to give this huge speech on campus there. Paul met his plane and taxied it in, to the airport and had a chance to meet the dignitaries. Paul was pretty apolitical from what we can tell up to that point, and it didn't exactly turn him in a different direction, but it opened his eyes. And can you imagine being 21 years old in 1962 and meeting John F. Kennedy? In 1960, the campaign. And it was just within a year or two after that that Paul enlisted in the Peace Corps. Whether Kennedy directly had an influence on that decision, we'll have to ask Pat. But this is the beginning of his life of public service in the Peace Corps. And then just the second year, I think, of the Peace Corps, Pat, his soon-to-be wife, was in the very first cohort of Peace Corps volunteers. So in the family, this was already, Paul went off to Ghana here. Pat went to the Philippines, but they would later meet when Paul was at the University of Michigan, where he was pursuing a career in forestry at that point and studying with this fellow in the middle, who was a leading forest ecologist at the time. And in the midst of that, he would meet and marry Pat, who was also, of course, a volunteer, and they bonded over that and many other things, I'm sure. They would again return to Africa. Eric, Annika's brother, was born in Ghana. So Paul's living in the world. He's out there. He's seeing things that he would not have seen in South Dakota or Chicago. They moved to Decorah, Iowa in 1974. Paul drops out of grad school, just this short of getting his PhD. All he had to do is turn it in, really. But he felt this compulsion with his wife, Pat, to go, as many others were doing, go back to the land. And after studying maps of the upper Midwest, settled on a farm outside of Decorah, Iowa, brought their family, which had already been begun, acquired those jerseys. This is actually the photo we were, I think, going to use for the cover. A couple of years after that, well, a decade actually after coming back, Paul stayed on the farm. He was taking care of the farm and raising the kids. Pat was working at Luther College in Decorah. I won't go into the full stories of how Paul got into the legislature. It is a good story of him being a rather, I won't say reluctant, but it was not his first priority. But he was elected, somewhat surprisingly, apparently. In 1984, took office in 1985, early 1985. Paul took office in January 1985. People, I see the heads nodding. People in this room know what was going on in 1984, 85, 86. You were in the very depths of the farm crisis here in Iowa. Not just in Iowa. It was a national phenomenon, but this was its epicenter. And this was the very first priority. The very first piece of writing in this book of Paul's writings is, in fact, a report back to his neighbors in Decorah about this being the #1 priority issue. And I really encourage you to talk with Ralph or Charlie, who were there. I'd hear it secondhand and talk to Paul about it, but these gentlemen were there, serving in this time of crisis in the rural agricultural Midwest. And again, it wasn't just an Iowa issue, it was a national crisis. And the fact that this book resonates now is not an accident. The writings the forces that were at work back then and the things Paul wrote about are still out there, and we're still wrestling with how to create a resilient, sustainable agriculture and human community. There was another big issue in the day having to do with the quality of water. In this case, groundwater. Surface water is all in the news right now, but they're connected. So the issues of groundwater contamination began to surface, no pun intended, again, making national news, which leads to one of the great accomplishments of Paul and his colleagues at the time, the 1987 Groundwater Protection Act, that did a lot of things. Again, this is part of it. I'm actually going to be doing a full lecture on this in January, so these are a few slides from that. I can give you information if you want to see the full deal. But these are some of the provisions that were built into the Groundwater Protection Act, but especially note that last bullet point, establishing the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture here at Iowa State University. And one of the writings in this book, Paul tells the story of how the act came to be. It was not easy lifting. This was a tough lift and fighting a lot of powerful forces. But in Paul's mind, I think it was also working to create an awareness and an ethic among the citizens of Iowa about this issue and, by extension, all issues that we share in common. The uniqueness of this act lies in its calling upon all Iowans to develop a conservation ethic through a host of programs in research, education, and demonstration. It wasn't just about a new law. It was about encouraging a new ethic. And in saying that, Paul was echoing, or invoking maybe is a better word, someone he had begun to read, maybe as a student. And through the 80s, as he served, became more aware of, and that is the figure of Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold is an Iowan. He was born in Burlington in 1887, as it turns out, 100 years before the Groundwater Act, and that's actually worth mentioning. So look there, October 5, 1986. Memorial Union Building at Iowa State University, the Aldo Leopold Centennial celebration. This is 4 months before the actual centennial. Whoever was here at Iowa State at the time was on it. I got invited. I was still a student and I spoke at this conference. And I was not comfortable doing that at all. I won't tell the whole story. I told it to some of the students today, but I contributed an essay in there about Aldo Leopold's writing on agriculture, which was a relatively, in fact, almost completely neglected aspect of Leopold's legacy. He was known for protecting wilderness. He was known for establishing wildlife ecology and management. He was known for lots of other things. His writing, he was not so well known for his writings on agriculture. This is an essay Leopold wrote in 1939. So Paul picked up on that, invoked Leopold, and hence you have the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State. Just a couple other of the highlights from Paul's time in the legislature. Again, not doing anything alone. But I've begun to appreciate more and more how important this piece of legislation was, which continues to this day. So the Resource Enhancement and Protection Act was another of the key contributions that continues to provide benefits to the land and to the people of Iowa. But look at Paul's language in writing about it. The air, water, soils, and biota of Iowa are interdependent, form of complex ecosystems. Iowans have the right to inherit this system in a sustainable condition without severe or irreparable damage caused by human activities. He's echoing Leopold, but he's bringing his own modern sensibility to this. This is really trying to find the right words to talk about a new concept. And that new concept went by the word of sustainability, right? I'll talk about that a little more. Just to mention one last one, the Iowa Energy Act. Ralph briefly mentioned that this was, again, another piece of landmark visionary legislation here in Iowa to encourage renewable energy and efficient energy use. It's 1987, 88, 89, a lot going on in those years from the global to the local. So internationally, we have this report by the UN that puts the concept of sustainability on the map, our common future. And yet right here in Iowa, practical farmers of Iowa. And I've always said this, I've said this in lectures for years and years, not in Iowa, far beyond Iowa. I said it was in Iowa in response to the farm crisis where the concept of sustainability got traction. It was kind of this fuzzy concept, sustainable what? No one can define it, and that was always the complaint about it. It was here in Iowa where that term got legs and got traction and began to mean something tangible on the ground. Paul brought that understanding and experience to the national stage when he became a member of the Board on Agriculture at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He was recognized for his work here in Iowa and began to gain national recognition for this. So those who don't know this, the National Academy is the congressionally mandated body that provides scientific input to policymaking. And in these years, the Board on Agriculture was beginning to publish a series of reports. Paul was on this board overseeing these reports. This is where I intersect with Paul. I'd met him before, but I was at work in that office in Washington, D.C. when Paul was a member of that board, and I worked on 3 of these reports as a staff person back in the early 90s. And I'll just point out 2 things. One, in the upper left here, that report called Alternative Agriculture. It was going to be called Sustainable Agriculture, but you couldn't use the S word in Washington, D.C. It was not allowed. Within a year or 2, however, look, towards sustainability. So there was a flip going on there. And I worked on, and actually, now that I think about it, I worked on 4 of these reports because that one in the bottom right almost killed me. A big fat project that Paul and I talked about a lot on looking at this from a global scale. This leads to Paul becoming head of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. As a national figure, he's now known nationwide for his leadership in the movement And he is now kind of, official Washington doesn't know who this guy is. And I love this quote. Monica has heard me use this one, but when Paul Johnson, an Iowa farmer and former state legislator, folk hero of the sustainable agriculture movement, you're getting the same reaction I was. It's like this backhanded compliment. Oh, isn't that cute? This nice farmer from Iowa coming to talk about sustainable agriculture. And I felt that too when I was there after having gone to school in Wisconsin. So Paul and I commiserated. I remember a few breakfasts where we talk about this and how the language reflects the status of official Washington. I won't go into the background much of the soil conservation service that Paul inherited, but it goes all the way back to the Dust Bowl years and the fight to address the national crisis, the climate change of its day of soil erosion in the middle of the Dust Bowl years. And so what was originally called the Soil Erosion Service became the Soil Conservation Service, became, under Paul's watch, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Paul oversaw that name change and the shift in the mission. There's a whole lecture that I will be giving online in January about Paul's time at NRCS and all that was done during those years. Under Paul's leadership, but with an amazing team of colleagues and policy experts who were part of that. I won't mention everything, but I will mention this report that I did highlight before. This was a report put out to make the case to anyone who would read it, not just to the agency and its own employees, but to the public and to other policymakers and elected officials, that private land conservation had to gain greater support, recognition, and recognition among everybody. So here's Paul. Yeah, Max, I don't know who that person is on the far side. We'll have to try to get a find. I have this photo at home, but this is Paul and colleagues at the Aldo Leopold shack outside Baraboo, Wisconsin. Paul had a thing. He liked when he had a big idea brewing to say, we need to go away, get away from the noise, meet and quietly and talk and listen to each other and try to figure out what we want to do. So they had a retreat in this place that has no running water, no electricity, probably mosquito ridden. Looking at the trees, it's mid-season. So this is Aldo Leopold's shack where he experienced the episodes that you read about in his book, Sand County Almanac. So out of this experience comes a statement of the importance of private lands, noting that they need not, as he says here, be devoted to single-purpose enterprise. With a broader understanding of the land and our place within it, our nation's farms, ranches, and private forest land can and do serve the multiple functions that we and all other life depend on. The reaction to this report was varied. This was a new kind of statement, a new kind of leadership when it comes to the mission of this agency, which, by the way, this is a piece of trivia for you. I didn't even know this until I looked it up. Guess how many agencies in the federal government have the word conservation in their title? One. This is it. It's the National Park Service. It's the U.S. Forest Service. There's only one federal agency that has the word conservation in its name. He serves there for 4 years. Here's Senator Harkin at the time wishing him well on his retirement. Vice President Gore wishing him well. Again, there's a lot of legacy in here. I won't go into these. I'm running short on time. I want to leave some time for Q&A, but this is maybe a teaser to tune in to the webinar I'll do in January. But it's just, I'll just highlight the two things here. There's a lot of change that went on within the agency, but also a lot beyond the NRCS itself. So I think I'm going to work toward the end here with just a few last quotes. Let Paul take us home in this presentation. So here is him summing up that cause which he felt so passionately about. private lands conservation deserves an elevated position within mainstream conservation and environmentalism. He's saying this to his own colleagues in conservation. And the societal commitment, separate and distinct from its current position as a stepchild within agribusiness-dominated farm policy. Whew. He did serve in the DNR here in Iowa. I'll skip through that. He did run for Congress in 2004 as an independent Democrat, trying to raise these issues. And he did in those last few years devote himself more to his family life, to his farm, to his writing, to being a speaker, to continuing to be a public servant, wearing a few different hats after that. But I'll close with just 3 more quotes and we can talk about this a little bit. Speaking to Iowa farmers, how they could proudly show the world that they can contribute to reducing climate change. And I include this because it shows you, starting with the farm crisis, when climate change was not a phrase being used, up to where we are now, while serving multiple functions rather than just growing corn and soybeans. I believe no agriculture is sustainable if it ignores the health of the natural ecosystem where it operates. So the works in this book of collected writings take you from the farm crisis, when the issues of the land and its ecology and wildlife and water quality were not the main issue. It was a social economic crisis. By the end, Paul is fully understanding that needs to be tied together with the ecological, environmental aspects as well. And since we're here in Ames and at a major research university, the purpose of research is not simply to produce more jobs. It's more than that. Now more than ever, research should be allowed to focus on public as well as private concerns. I'll just conclude by saying, first of all, again, thank you to you all. I hope Paul's writing does a few things going forward. I hope especially for younger people in the audience and in your lives, this helps to show that arc, show that what has happened over the last 2 generations that Paul lived through, commented on, and tried to improve for the better. I hope it provides insight into the changes that led us up to where we are now. And especially, I did very much have younger people in my mind in compiling this, and it was so much in Paul's mind. He talked, and Annika has mentioned this in the last few days, how at the very end he says, I wish I had 30 more years. I want to see what this next generation is going to do. And in this time of division and crisis and really ugly public life, we need this more than ever. Paul's one example. To me, he's a great example, but there are others, including those in the room with us today. So I hope it provides a little bit of a different, kind of a relief in reading Paul's words from the current crosswinds that we all feel. So I'm going to stop there because my mouth is getting dry and I have water right here. And happy to talk and take your comments and questions and talk more about this work.
Oh, I was just, I was struck by one of the pieces of legislation that says that we have the right in Iowa to have inherit the ecosystem unimpaired. And I was thinking about the people in Montana, the young people who sued on behalf of their heritage being, that I didn't know that like Montana, we had a similar, and I wonder whether anybody has thought about anchoring some court cases to that legislation. That's all.
Yeah, very briefly, he's kind of informally stating what would become a more formalized legal approach, which is to assert the rights of nature. And there are a number of countries, states, and other legal entities that have said we need to allow entities in the natural world to have rights. And in Wisconsin, young people are suing over climate right now too. And that's another part of the movement. But yeah, and I would mention too, my friends in the Ho-Chunk Nation, who I work with back in Wisconsin a lot. The Ho-Chunk Nation was one of the first tribes in the U.S. to introduce into their constitution a rights of nature statement too. So it is a part of a larger movement, and there's lots written on this. I won't go on to it right now, but you're right on, Paul. When I heard that myself, I said, that's interesting. They're intuiting what would be in the next decade or two, something of a more regular statement.
When I was on staff at the Leopold Center, Dennis Keeney, the first director of the Leopold Center, it had been a really hard year. It was sometime after the legislature had gone home for the session, and I don't remember particularly what we were so down and out about. Well, it would have been probably 1999, right after Paul had retired from the NRCS, and Dennis asked Paul if he would come and talk to the staff. So we had a staff meeting with Paul, and I asked him questions, and Paul was always, he was such a cheerleader. He would give us hope and try to, keep going, keep at it. And that's what I will always remember about Paul. And we condensed some of his comments and put it in our newsletter. But I remember that so well.
Yeah.
And it was such a wonderful thing that Dennis had him come, and we were so interested in what he had done, and it just helped us carry on.
Was that when they first took money away from the Leopold Center?
It probably would have been 1999, because it was before Fred came, and Fred came in 2001. So it was right before Dennis retired.
If I could add one quick note to that, you reminded me of something Paul always did when, especially when he was speaking to his own employees in the agencies that he worked, or when speaking to people in public universities, and that was always to thank public servants for their service. And I saw him do this dozens of times in front of audiences. And we're in a time when we not only don't appreciate we actually are actively punishing public servants right now. So the reclaiming of the honor of public service is something that I think Paul would have been deeply committed to right now at this moment.
Curt, as you know, we've had ever since 1937, when the first Farm Bill was written in the midst of the Dust Bowl years, every 5 years that Farm Bill gets rewritten. But in 1985 or 86, that Farm Bill in the midst of the farm crisis really underwent a very fundamental change, and the conservation title became a really important part, much more than it had been prior to that. I wonder if Paul, while he was in Washington, had influence on, or have you been able to find influence on subsequent farm bills that were rewritten? WRP, I think, was added about that time, the Wetland Reserve Program, those sorts of things.
Yeah. So much of the history of private land conservation is written through the farm bills. We don't teach that history very well. I mean, that's a great way to begin to appreciate it. But yes, in 1996, the Farm Bill was being re-upped then, and Paul played a very key role in it. I'm going to keep looking to Max here. I feel embarrassed to even talk about this. Max is in daily conversation probably at that time with Paul. But the thing I most remember from that particular Farm Bill cycle was Paul's effort to reach out to environmental organizations who had not been involved that much in Farm Bill negotiations on Capitol Hill. They didn't see the Farm Bill as having that much relevance to environmental concerns. I'm kind of simplifying it, but he was frustrated, actually. He said, wait a minute, this is the most important piece of environmental legislation we pass. So he actually reached out and said, maybe you want to come and talk to me and share your ideas about what this Farm Bill should contain. That's the main thing. I hope I'm remembering that right. I'm going to talk to Max about this afterwards, but he was very conscious of that divide between the urban audience that was environmentally inclined and the rural audience that had the older conservation tradition, and helping to overcome that divide, which is still, so problematic and deep. That was one of Paul's very conscious pursuits in the policy arena. In the 96 Farm Bill, the one that did bring us some of the most important new programs, including WRP, yeah, is really one of the ones that he was so devoted to that. Yeah. So and you'll read about that in some of the essays he published. Yeah.
I was interested in his Peace Corps work in Ghana, and I've worked some in rural Denmark. The idea that Americans have of it's my own land, it's my private property, and nobody can tell me what to do. This I think is almost unique to the United States. That, I mean, did he get some of these ideas from maybe from Ghana and from the ways that people thought of private property?
What an interesting question. First of all, I'm going to give a book recommendation since we're in the library. Megan, there's a book called Land by Simon Winchester, a very actually quite best-selling author. It's a big fat book. I just finished reading it. I bought it 2 years ago, and it's exactly on this theme. How people around the world in different cultures and different times have thought about land and the concept of ownership and property. And this book goes into great detail. It's very readable. So there's a book recommendation for you. Paul was drawing on a lot of sources. That's a very interesting question. I can't answer it. Certainly being exposed to different land tenure systems, as we call them, in other parts of the world, not only in Africa, but through his wife, understanding maybe perhaps a bit of the Philippines, traveling in Europe, which Paul did, and across the US, where owning private land is different here than it is in Nevada or it is in Florida. So he was no doubt thinking, but also thinking about Leopold. And one way to understand Aldo Leopold is someone who is aware of the fact that our attitude of treating land as a commodity instead of a community, in Leopold's words, was at the root of so many of our ills. Doesn't mean we're going to throw out the private property system right away, but it does mean that thinking about land in an ethical sense, thinking about not only the human community, but the land as a community, that began to filter into Paul's work more and more and more. And that's a kind of a sign of the difference between Paul as a legislator in 1985 and Paul at the end of his federal career. When you read that stuff about the farm crisis, it's not talking about these conservation issues and the public good in the sense of land as a community. By the end of his federal career, he is very strongly speaking in that language. So that's a great question. And I wish I could answer it more, but maybe Annika has some insights because she may have talked to him more about his Peace Corps years. It's not something he wrote much about, was his Peace Corps experience. So makes me curious too to see if we can learn some more.
I don't have a great recollection of that. I think my mom probably knows more, but I did want to just speak to the point earlier about some sort of a resolution, because it's only after my father's passing on the 15th of February, 2021, that it was sent to my mom, that Iowa Representative Chuck Eisenhart, and many of you may know of him, introduced a joint resolution to amend the state constitution here in Iowa to protect everybody's right to healthy water, air, soil, water, air, SWAPA, what Dad would say, soil, water, air, plants, and animals, plus H, humans. Dad always added there. And the resolution still resides in the state legislature because, of course, it has not gone anywhere. But that was sent to us, and that resolution was brought forward in honor of Paul's passing. So you can actually go online and see that YouTube video of him proposing that amendment to the Constitution, which, yeah, it's sad that nothing has happened with it, but it's a privilege that I think Mom really appreciated seeing, that on behalf of Paul, that was brought forward. So maybe in the future, young people run for office and pass it through.
We have a question from one of our online viewers. What is left of the NRCS? Are they still functioning? Have there been layoffs?
Oh boy, I haven't read the paper today. For you, if you didn't hear the question, how's the NRCS faring right now? I can only tell you from my own experience back in Wisconsin, working with colleagues in the federal agencies. The sister agency to NRCS is ARS, the Agricultural Research Service. And they were decimated earlier this year. One of my former students works in that agency in my neighborhood. And she lost her entire lab. She had 12 young, bright scientists, some of the best. I knew some of them. And they were all let go. They were just let go overnight on Valentine's Day. And these are young people just embarking on their careers. So that morale hit, it's going to last a lifetime. They've clawed back some, and I'm assuming this is somewhat true in the NRCS. Maybe someone in the room actually knows better than I, but NRCS is taking a major, major cut. What's interesting about that is Paul had to do the same thing. When he became chief of the NRCS in 1994, he was actually acting de facto before then. He was told, you're going to have to reduce your workforce by 10%. So imagine becoming the head of an agency and your first thing to do is to decimate your own agency. But what Paul was able to do, and maybe Max, you have a different memory of this than I, but he honored the older senior employees in that agency, even though he had a different viewpoint. He appreciated their lifetimes of service again, even if it was different from what his priorities were. But they had done a noble work that had made the world a better place. And he stated that, even while diversifying that agency a lot in the aftermath of that cut. So they were able to minimize the harm it would do. And not only that, they did it through an open, public, transparent process that involved hearings all around the country. Before making any cuts, they would go and talk and listen. So it's I haven't, until this year, I didn't really think about that as much as I have, obviously, in the last 9 months. But again, I can't speak to the exact situation with NRCS, and it may differ state by state too, because they're organized by state offices. But I know in Wisconsin, it's been a pretty hard time.
Any other questions?
Thank you to the Zoom audience. We didn't say that. Thank you, Zoomers.
I can make another statement with regards to the current insanity out at the National Animal Disease Center. They changed all the animal caretakers a few months ago, so they'd be in a different pay grade, so there'd be potential for raises. Well, that made them provisional employees. So they all got let go.
Yeah.
So the scientists had to take care of the animals for several weeks because there were no animal caretakers. And then eventually they got them rehired. But that's the kind of insanity that we're dealing with. Ignorance and incompetence at the top. And they have no concept of what they're doing down at the local level. So.
Well, thank you for adding that, Mark, because I'm trying to be diplomatic up here. But let's focus on the younger people in the back of the room here. Don't get discouraged by all this at all, because you are going to be part of whatever is going to come next. And it's going to require a lot of work, but you're not starting from scratch. You're building on the work of so many, including many in this room, and so many farmers. Let's not forget how many farmers across the landscape. I was just talking about Practical Farmers of Iowa and how you didn't recognize it anywhere. It's gotten so large and so big. Yeah, you lose some things with that shift, but it's a testament to how many people care. And so, whether it's the rights of nature and entities that has been proposed, or whether it's trying to understand how we can reconstitute these agencies and respect public service again, or whether we can talk about maybe finding a new way to give the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture a new lease on life. these are all important and worthy efforts to put ourselves behind. And I hope this book helps to remind us how we did it once before. We'll do it again because we have to.
Here's the microphone, just because otherwise it doesn't come through on the recording.
So where was the turning point? I mean, things were really moving pretty well, but then what happened? And in my own career, having, worked at the Soil Health Lab, worked for Practical Farmers, worked for the DOT and vegetation management, revegetation, where I saw a turning point is when the federal legislation, like for wetland mitigation and endangered species, became so, the fines and the just the holding government agencies accountable became so strong that the more, how can I say, the mushier language, laws that had things related to sustainable or integrated pest management, they took a backseat. And, I asked, well, okay, we've got a conflict. We're supposed to, with, we have one thing that says we're supposed to use pesticides wisely in an integrated approach, only use things judicially when they're necessary. But then we have federal legislation that requires management of trees or for bat preservation. So the result was the DOT would just cut down all the trees because they didn't want, during the non-bat regulation period, or I shouldn't say all the trees, but like if there was brush removal project, they'd cut down the trees ahead of time because they didn't want a tree to be there later to hold up construction. And I would ask, well, and then contracts had to be written in a way that any brush removal had to be done before March 30th for bat protection. Well, what happened, so to get contractors come in, they would be doing all that brush work in March and February. Well, that's the worst time to be applying herbicide. It's not very effective at that time of the year. It's much more effective in the fall or during the growing season.
To summarize your question?
Yeah.
Because the Zoom audience may not have been able to hear.
So where was this change?
When, I think I grasp what you're getting at. When did the changes, either in our political culture or in our larger kind of dynamic of considering these issues, when did it change? It's always changing, but there are inflection points along the way. And when again, I'm not from Iowa, so I don't see it as close up as you do, but when I've been asked that question before, and sometimes it's framed this way, how did Iowa change from the time Paul was in office to when it is now? And again, I'm not a student of Iowa history, but I'll mention sometimes I'll mention a few things. I'll say, well, one inflection point was when the ethanol mandate was put in. And most people outside of the Midwest won't even understand what that means. But people in this room do understand that the power of the agricultural interests, this is now speaking at this level rather than a very local level, but, and I got involved in those debates. I gave a lecture once, and the lecture, I was assigned a topic. What would Aldo Leopold think about corn ethanol? Right? And I remember a fellow from Iowa State came over to Madison to talk, and I'm like, and if you want the answer, by the way, it's not, I don't know what Aldo Leopold would have thought about anything, but I can tell you how he would have thought about it. How you would think about complex environmental management questions. And this gets to maybe, I think, what you were trying to ask, and that is, when did we stop thinking critically and thoughtfully about making decisions, whether it's at the very local level or at the global climate change level, right? Well, there's not one point, so.
And it's wherever the fines are the strongest.
It's definitely the enforcement part of this. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to be staying up all night now thinking about it. Well, I'm going to stick around. So if you have more questions or want to share more stories, and I know how much it's meant to Annika, especially being a representative of the family here, to hear some of your stories. So please stick around and talk with us.